On Monday afternoon, the Israeli government announced that they would be tabling a motion for dissolution next week. If the motion passes, which looks likely, then Israel will be headed for its 5th election in 3 years. So, in this video, we're going to look at why the government collapsed, what might happen next, and whether this could presage the return of former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Before we start, a bunch of our viewers didn't know that we actually have other YouTube channels. You can find out much more news from us if you head over to TLDR UK, US and Global. Subscribe to the channels you're interested in, or just all of them, to get the most from TLDR and stay in the loop. They're linked below. Anyway, to understand why the government collapsed, you need a bit of context. Israel uses nationwide proportional representation with an electoral threshold of just 3.25%, which means that any party receiving more than 3.25% of votes across the country will receive a place in the 120-seat legislature, known as the Knesset. This electoral system, combined with the diversity of political thought in Israel, means that no party has ever won an outright majority in an election, and coalition governments are the norm. This worked relatively well until 2019, when then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was beset by various corruption scandals. Netanyahu was eventually indicted in November 2019 for 3 charges of corruption relating to his favourable treatment of certain Israeli businessmen, perhaps most notably his personal friend Sheldon Adelson. Adelson owns the 2 largest newspapers in Israel by circulation, and it's alleged that Netanyahu tried to strike a deal that would have provided him with positive coverage. As of the 21st of June 2022, the trial is still ongoing. Anyway, while Netanyahu was only indicted in November, the rumours first started circulating in 2016, and by early 2019 it was clear that Netanyahu would face charges. That's why, despite winning a plurality in the April 2019 elections, Netanyahu's party were unable to form a government, with the second-placed Blue and White Party refusing to enter into a coalition. After a month of negotiations, on May the 29th, the Knesset voted 74 to 45 in favour of dispersing, with new elections due for September. This time, Likud came in second place, winning 1 fewer seat than the more centrist Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz, and Yair Lapid, who shared a rotating premiership. Unfortunately for Israeli politics, the vote was more split than in April, and the Knesset again failed to agree on a government, with yet a 3rd set of elections due for March 2020. In the interim, Netanyahu tried and failed to secure a vote of immunity for himself in the Knesset, which would have protected him from the pending corruption charges. Anyway, the March 2020 result looked a lot like the previous results. Again, Likud and Blue and White ended up being the 2 largest parties by quite some distance, with Likud winning 36 seats and Blue and White winning 33. This time, Blue and White agreed to a coalition with Likud, having previously ruled out any agreement with Netanyahu on the basis of his corruption charges. According to the terms of the agreement, Netanyahu would be Prime Minister for the first 18 months of the government, before handing over to Gantz, who was now the sole leader of Blue and White after Yair Lapid returned to his party. This government promptly collapsed in December 2020, after failing to pass a budget, with the 4th set of elections held in March 2021. Again, Netanyahu won a plurality of 30 seats, well ahead of second-placed Yesh Atid, but again he was unable to form a coalition. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin then asked Yair Lapid, leader of Yesh Atid, whether he would be able to form a government, giving him 28 days to do so. Now, at the time, most commentators weren't too optimistic about Yesh Atid leading a government, given that they'd only won 17 seats. Nonetheless, on Wednesday the 2nd of June, the last day of the deadline, reports emerged that Yesh Atid had somehow managed to cobble together a mishmashed 61-seat coalition involving 8 separate parties. The most surprising names on the list were Yamina, which is led by tech millionaire and ex-finance minister Naftali Bennett, and RAM, which is an Arab party led by ex-dentist Mansour Abbas. While most of the other parties on the list are centre or even centre-left parties, Yamina is more right-wing Israeli nationalist. Their leader, Naftali Bennett, is a religious nationalist who advocates for the Israeli settler movement and has ruled out any two-state solution, which makes it all the more surprising that Yamina will be in coalition with RAM, an Islamist party that advocates for a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. The only thing that these parties really agree on was getting rid of Netanyahu, but this was enough at the time. Now, this coalition was always going to be tricky. It had a tiny 1-seat majority and included both Arab and Israeli nationalists. To be fair to them, the coalition did surprisingly well. They successfully passed a budget in November, navigated the coronavirus pandemic, and strengthened relations with both the Biden administration and Israel's Arab allies. However, in March, a Yamina member withdrew from the coalition, depriving them of a majority. And on June the 13th, another Yamina member withdrew, reducing the government to a minority. Yamina, by the way, is a right-wing Zionist party that was never fully on board. One Yamina member refused to join the coalition in the first place over its inclusion of left-wing and Arab parties. Anyway, the immediate cause of the collapse was a disagreement within the coalition over a law concerning the legal status of Israeli settlers on the West Bank, considered illegal by the international community. But it's really just a symptom of the underlying ideological tensions within the coalition. Anyway, on Monday afternoon, the coalition admitted that it had been unable to convince any of its former members, and said it would be tabling a motion to dissolve the Knesset next week. Unless they can find a new coalition partner in the next week, this means that Israel will be headed for its 5th election in 3 years. And this is bad news for anyone in Israel who's fed up with political crises, because polling suggests that forming a government won't be easy. Much like in the last election, Likud are on track to win about 35 seats, while Yesh Atid are predicted to win about 20. If this happens, the electoral maths will be just as different as last time round. But this time, there'll also be the bad blood between the various coalition partners who've fallen out over the last few months. All in all, it looks like Israel's political crises are set to continue, and we could even see the return of Netanyahu. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to subscribe to TLDR EU. Remember, you can get a whole lot more from TLDR by making sure you're subscribed to our other channels too. TLDR Daily, Global, UK and US. Thanks for your support.